recall what year that was?
1994. November 2nd, 1994 was the first day then.
Where were you living at the time?
Well, at the time I was living with my mother in New York, in Richmond Hill, New York.
Why did you enlist?
Well, pretty much I needed money for school. There was, I'd pretty much hit a lull in my life, and I think that at that time was probably the best thing for me. And it was definitely, I wouldn't say I was running away from something, but it definitely gave me a new perspective.
Was this the year after you graduated from high school?
No, I'd graduated. I'm originally from Trinidad, and I graduated from high school before I'd left. This is probably, I graduated from high school when I just turned 15. So
You graduated from high school when you were 15 years old?
Mm-hmm. Actually, it was about, I think it was like 2 weeks after my 15th birthday. So I went to Fatima College and graduated in Form 5 in 1987. I was in there. So I graduated from high school for some time. I was actually one of the older ones in boot camp.
What branch of the service did you enlist in?
Air Force. The funny thing about that was that I showed up to the Navy recruiter's office because at first I figured I wasn't going to join the Marines or the Army, that it was either going to be the Navy or the Air Force. And so I called the Navy recruiter and went into his office. And it was a small space in New York, and there were like 7 recruiters and probably about like a 30 by 20 office. It wasn't very large. Like you had like desks and spaces in the middle for that, and then you had a partition where the NCOIC sat behind, I'm assuming. I don't think I ever saw them. And had a great discussion with the recruiter, and he was like, yeah, you'll make rank quicker in the Navy, and at the time, boot camp is like 8 weeks. You'll be all set. It was either 8 weeks or 3 months, I can't remember which. Right, we said, yep, you'll be all set, and you want to learn something, you stick your hand up and, show that you're willing, and you can learn lots of stuff, especially when you're on board. And so I was like, cool, great, sign me up. And he turns to me and he says, well, just for perspective, I want you to walk across the hallway and go talk to the Air Force recruiter and see what it's like over on their side. And when you're done, come on back and we'll take care of you. And so I was like, okay. And I walked across the hallway, and there was Tech Sergeant at the time, John Brown. He's a black guy, probably about 5'3", and a former police officer, Air Force cop, who was doing recruiting duty. And what was interesting was that it was him by himself in this office, standard desk, had posters on the floor. It was kind of bare, right? But he was really easygoing. He was low key, and he was like, yeah, there's that rank thing with the Navy, but our boot camp 6 weeks. You'll get through that, and we tend to take care of our people a lot better than they do, right? And I'm new to this. I was like, okay, this is sounding good. And he did the low key and slow approach. And after a while, it was like, this Air Force gig sounds a lot better. And so I went back to the Navy recruiter and he says, I'm going to stay across the hallway. And the look on his face was like, you're serious? I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go Air Force. And so I signed up Air Force.
Did you sign up that day?
I think within a little time, I remember I'd lost my green card, which is fairly serious, and so I had to apply for a replacement. And Sergeant Brown, to his credit, actually came and helped me go through the process and stuff and vouch for me. Well, not that I needed it, but to see if we could speed it up. And that probably delayed my enlistment by about 4 months.
Wow. When you finally were able to join, found your green card, where did you go for your induction and basic training?
MEPS was at the Military Entrance Processing Station, was at Fort Hamilton in New York. It's pretty much of a joint base that is almost exclusively for MEPS purposes.
For what purposes?
Military Entrance Processing Station, or MEPS. That's where they do like the testing, the initial medical testing, and all your paperwork and everything there. And I remember actually walking in there, and there was a Tech Sergeant Carrasco, Air Force Tech Sergeant, and she was pregnant at the time. And she was the nastiest person I think I met all the way through the process. Because when I told her, when she said, well, why aren't you going in right now? And I said, well, I lost my green card. And she's like, I remember her looking at me going, you serious? I'm like, yeah. And she's like, you don't really have a green card, do you? You're just making this up. And I'm looking at her like, you have 6 heads? Are you dumb? So kind of got through that. And I was pretty glad actually not to have to see her again. She was not a happy person at all. But went through MEPS. I thought the funniest thing was the night before you leave, they put you up in a hotel, and you know we're what we call rainbows because you're wearing like different color shirts and stuff, and we're all like hanging out and stuff. And then they get the call, and the wake up call, because you leave on the bus at a certain time. You meet downstairs. And you get to MEPS. And the first thing they do is give you a breathalyzer test. And if you fail the breathalyzer test, right, for any amount of alcohol, then you're delayed 6 months. And 2 people failed. So.
How long did you actually stay at MAPS? But you only stay there, you don't do your basic training?
No, MAPS is just processing. So essentially, once you get there, once you get to the hotel, you get there, they then ship you to the hotel so that you sleep, so that you spend the night. You get back there, they feed you and do your initial processing, and then you're on a flight to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, which, as far as I'm aware, is the only basic training location for the Air Force.
And how long was basic training?
6 weeks. We started 2nd of November, I think we started. We got there like maybe 2 days early. And we were the last graduating class before Christmas, because I remember that year they'd shipped, I'd gone for technical school, which was at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas. We had gotten there, it was either December 23rd or 24th, and I checked into on-base hotel, and I remember sleeping, and for the first time in a long time actually getting enough sleep and waking up. Which I think kind of cut me a break, because normally that doesn't happen.
What was your basic training like?
I think that's when you first realize that basic training is just a mental game. That there was a lot of like yelling and shouting and screaming and all the good stuff. And I think the hardest part was probably the first like week and a half, when you're just trying to get into the groove of things. I was an element leader. The way how the structure works is that everything's broken up into squadrons. Ours was the 332nd Squadron, if memory serves correct. And then under the squadron, you have the training. You have you have training groups, and you have a dorm chief. That's you have a dorm chief, which is one of the recruits that's in charge of everyone. Above him is your TL, or training leader, who is a enlisted member. And then you had elements, which were about 10 to 12 guys, and I was one of the element leaders. But basic training.
How did you get selected to be an element leader?
Initially I didn't, and the guy who was our element leader failed miserably. And before that I'd asked, I don't know, a little gumption, I walked up to the TL and was like, "Sir, if the opportunity arises, I'd like to be an element leader." And I think probably like in the first week, this guy got demoted. He wasn't exactly he wasn't a great people person. He was kind of like really little introverted, a little shy, and in the middle of marching somewhere, I think he just wasn't loud. And finally, the TL was like, "Stop! Go to the back. All right, he says, "Suares, get up here!" And I was like, "Huh?" And he says, "All right, lead the element out." And pretty much I became the element leader, and it stuck until I graduated.
What were your duties as an element leader?
The hardest one was the fact that since we had to post rotating shifts, the element leader's rotating shift always happened between the hours of 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. So pretty much that night, since you went to bed around 10, you got like 3 hours of sleep, and then you had to get up, and you were in charge of a bunch of troops. I mean, it's your first real leadership. And I don't know, I had particularly one guy in my troop, a guy by the name of Alan. I can't remember his first name, but he was an interesting one. And what made him remarkable was that he was a little different. He was definitely struggling, and we constantly had to carry him through, make sure that everything, all his stuff was squared away, help him polish his boots and all this stuff. And then in week 4, just before we went to the rifle range in week 5, one of the other element leaders went to help him do something, and this guy reached into his personal drawer. There were a bunch of pictures that he'd drawn, and the one on the top was of a guy in green with a rifle shooting at a whole bunch of other guys in a group, and they were like, "This isn't kosher." And they went to to our enlisted guide, and they got him out of there in a matter of probably an hour, 45 minutes. He was gone. But yeah, there's some pretty scary people that you meet.
Do you have any recollection of any of your instructors from basic training?
Yeah, I think you're always going to remember your TL. I think that.
Do you remember yours name?
No, I remember his face, but nah. He was a bit brusque, as you expect him to be. I mean, I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot in terms of leadership. Both what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do, and why they were like that. It was pretty interesting. Yeah, there were quite a few of them. Some of them were more interesting than others. One of them, actually, a staff sergeant, I think his last name was Panic, was a reservist from Texas. He was from the area. And he had that like fake meanness, which I've come to appreciate now. But at the time, you were like this guy is like an animal. And there was another one within the training group called Bomar, Staff Sergeant Bomar, who ended up later on at Cannon Air Force Base. But that's another story. But these guys. I remember Panic one day, we're in our last week, and he calls us all, and he said, because they give you stupid rules to follow in basic training just to see if you follow them. Obviously, you had to fold your t-shirts a certain way, and then the ends of the t-shirts, you literally had to sit with a pair of tweezers and tweeze them all straight. So you have these shirts, which are these cheap cotton shirts, and you wash them once, and the ends of the shirts obviously are like a map of Italy. There's like the coastline, and you had to sit there with a pair of tweezers and pull these things all straight and make sure that they're nice and level. And I remember him telling us, and he says, "Want to know what my room looks like?" He says, I get my laundry and I throw it in my closet. He says, in my t-shirts, I don't even hang them up. I just throw them in there too, and I go in there and I dig them. And he said, when you get out into the real Air Force, that's what it's like. But when you're here, this is how you got to do it, because this is how we're going to teach you. And this is, we tell you to follow instructions. And he goes on, and we were sitting there. And this is probably one of the funnier parts of it, because he was actually talking to us like we were real people for once. It was pretty funny. So he was fun. Bomar was another one. He used to call everybody Chuck, and didn't matter, guy or gal. What's up, Chuck? Are you smart today, Chuck? And you'd be like, at the time you were terrified of him, and after a couple of weeks you'd realize, okay, yeah, he's just.
Now, in your training in basic, at that point, did everybody get trained for exactly the same thing? You haven't specialized yet?
Correct. Not until you go to technical school, tech school, do you specialize. There, you're basically learning about the Air Force, standards of dress. There's actually what they call the Airman Training Order, which I still have a copy of, that all the things that you need to learn are in this. At the end of in the last week of basic training, they do a physical fitness test, which was 6 laps on a track that you had to do in under 12 minutes, and then you had to take this test, and if you failed the test, then you got recycled. So, and in order to become an honor, what they call an honor candidate, which means that you get a special medal, you had to basically get no demerits, what we call 341s, which were these little pieces of paper that they gave you, and any time that you got in trouble, basically you handed over a 341, which instead of doing push-ups, they were of the mind that they didn't make you do push-ups except for PT anymore, which I found interesting. So if you didn't have any demerits, and you aced the test, which means you got, I think, better than 80%, and you clocked under 11:30 for the run, then you became an honor graduate. And I think within the 2 flights that we had, which was our flight and our brother flight, we had one honor graduate, and he was like I think he was like a pad cleaner or something for basic training. Basically, he scrub bird pigeon poop off of the under pads underneath the dorms. So pretty much he was like nondescript guy, just like did what he asked, kept his head down, interesting guy.
After your 6 weeks at Lockwood, where did you go?
Got on the bus and drove somewhere between 6 to 8 hours to Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas. I think at that point is when I found out that there is an ugly side to Texas, because the landscape was just gray. There was nothing pretty about it. The rocks were ugly. It was just a large wasteland going through this. There's little vegetation. I remember the bus ride. I remember passing Baylor Medical School and thinking, hey, that's Dr. DeBakey, that's where he's from. That was probably the most interesting thing other than lunch.
How long did you stay at Shepherd?
A little longer than I had to. Once I got to Shepherd, I applied to be a student leader, what they call a rope, because they would wear these ropes, ROPE. They would wear these ceremonial ropes around your left shoulder. And pretty much it indicated you were a student leader, and there were 3 grades of student leader. There was a green rope, which pretty much was the lowest level, and there was a yellow rope, which meant that you were like an intermediate. And then each group had one red rope, which was basically the guy who was in charge of all the ropes. And I was a green rope almost the whole way through.
Did you have to have special training to be a green rope?
Yeah, actually, they even gave us, we went through leadership training, and they even gave us a little certificate, which is in the packet over there. So, learned quite a bit, but I think after my 4 hours of learning and all this other good stuff and doing well as a rope, the best piece of leadership advice came from our red rope, who was this Puerto Rican kid from Chicago. Very, very down to earth. Can we use bad language on this? No, okay. But his basic thing, because he came up to me one day and he says, you know what? He says, sometimes to be a leader, you have to be a dick. There's just no other way about it. You get there, you do your thing, right? Because sometimes they won't listen otherwise, and you just need to get your point across. I kind of scratched my head because I was trying to be like the nice guy all the time, and it didn't quite work. But all through my leadership positions afterward, it's kind of proven to be true sometimes. That, I mean, it doesn't have to be all the time, but I think there are some times when you really have to be forceful. And I think that's probably the best piece of leadership advice I've ever gotten, as strange as it is.
Now, at Shepherd, why were you at Shepherd? What kind of training were you getting? Was it just for the rope training?
No, Shepherd had sponsored probably quite a bit of tech schools. They were part of what at the time was Air Education and Training Commander, AETC, and they taught undergrad. They taught flight school for pilots, like jets and stuff. Where I first saw my first T-38, where I saw my first F-15, which is kind of cool because I think we had been there like 4 days and we're in civvy clothes and decided to walk down to the flight line where some F-16s were taking off. And you don't realize how loud an F-16 is until you're probably about, I don't know, it's probably about 75 feet from the runway when this thing came, and you're seeing it in the distance and it's starting to gain speed and it's coming towards you. You're like, it's cool, it's kind of cute and stuff. And then he gets closer and you hear the whoa. And by the time he was right next to us, I think he had full afterburner on and the front gear was up. And he was probably about, say, anywhere between 5 to 10 feet off the runway, and it was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life to that point. I was like, "Wow, okay, yeah, this is not what I see in movies." It was really, really, really loud. I can't really explain to you what it's like until you've experienced that. Needless to say, I've kind of avoided being that close since. But
so what was your purpose at Shepherd?
I was part of the correction. I had an ASVAB score. This goes back to my recruiter. I scored 97 out of 99 in the ASVAB services vocational aptitude battery, which was the highest score that my recruiter had ever gotten. I remember the next morning after I woke up to the phone ringing. And he was like, "You never believe this! You never believe this!" And I'm like, "You scored 97!" And I was kind of like half asleep going, "So? What does that mean?"
What's that stand for? Armed Services?
Vocational Aptitude Battery. Here I think they allow you to take it in high school. I pretty much, I thought it was fairly easy. And I didn't think that it was too much. And there were people failing that all the time. So I thought it was kind of okay.
So because you had scored high on that, they decided they were going to train you?
I was pretty much eligible for anything that I could get into, that I was qualified for.
So you could choose what you wanted to specialize in?
No. In basic training, what they do is that they give you a list of things. Basically, they give you a list of all the choices you have for career fields. And they make you make a list from 1 to 10 of what you're interested in. And I think my first 4 or 5 were medical. I think my first one was cardiac tech, but the class was full apparently. So I ended up being a pharmacy tech.
So
then the medical...
Where they taught you to be the pharmacist?
Shepherd is the training school for all biomedical sciences. That's where their school is. It's a really nice building. At the time was pretty modern. I haven't been back since.
How many weeks was the training for pharmacy tech?
3 months.
What kind of things did they teach you?
Everything. I mean, we went, because you think you know about medicines and you think you know about
Did you have
medical.
any previous medical training at all?
No, not before then. But it started off with like simple algebra and that kind of stuff, which we aced. Most of us aced. There wasn't an issue. Then they started getting into medical terminology and that kind of stuff. And eventually, the two toughest courses were what they call Drug 1 and Drug 2, where you had to learn probably close to 200 to 300 drugs, side effects, what they do, what they're for, drug classes, and it was just a really intense cram fest.
How big was your class?
25 people, 25 people. Actually, no, it wasn't that. It couldn't be that long. I have a picture of the class, so probably about 12 to 18. But we had a new class probably every month.
Did you have physical training, or was it all classroom training?
All class. There was, at this point, the physical requirements in the Air Force were once a year, so you're pretty much done. You passed it in basic training, you're good for the year.
After your 3 months pharmacy tech training, where did you go?
I went to, I was selected to go to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, but I'd end up staying at at tech school a little longer. I'd passed the class, but being that I was a rope, I pulled what we call desk duty. Basically, I was what they call the officer of the day, where I'd check people's IDs and stuff at the front desk. And there was this one kid who was a known troublemaker who was restricted to the dorms, who decided that he was going to the dorm passes are essentially what tells the people at the front desk what group you belong to. And what they do is that there are what they call phases. When you first get into the tech school, you're in phase 1, where where the rules are structured so that it's pretty much a lot like what you would do in basic training. If you leave your room, you have to be in full uniform. You can't go out after certain hours and that kind of stuff. Phase 2 is a little more relaxed, where you can wear civilian clothes in the dorms, but once you leave the building. Phase 3, you can wear civvies anytime. And in phase 4, you don't have to march to class, which actually was a really big deal. You can actually drive if you have a car, if you have friends with cars, but generally you didn't get phase 4 until you've been there a really long time. Right? I ended up being in phase 4, but for other reasons. And this guy had taken, and the cards were probably about this big, and they fit like in a wallet. And what they would do is that there was a red stamp that they would put on the thing to signify what phase you were in. And this guy had taken a red marker, and he was in phase 1, had drawn 2 other 1s in there. And this was a really, really big dude. I mean, he was easily about 6'1", he was fairly well built, and I think crazy is an understatement, right? But apparently he had been warned and was going in for a court-martial. And then I bust him. And so I was retained as a witness to his court-martial. And so pretty much they were like, well, it's nice that you're a student leader and all, but you got to stay until his court-martial. You can't go anywhere. And so it ended up I ended up being there about 3 extra weeks after school was done. Because once they told me that, I was like, the last part of our class was a self-paced module you could do as long as you want. So I basically made it last. I just stretched it out as long as I could until finally I was like, no, I don't need to do this anymore. And so I finished it, and pretty much they put me on base detail. So I was mowing lawns and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. But the only good thing about that is that I got phase 4, so I can come and go as I please, relatively speaking. But pretty much during the duty day, I was doing all sorts of crazy stuff.
So after that guy's court-martial, you went on to McGuire?
I left, went home for 10 days, where they did, there was a gig where you could go home and help your recruiter for like 10 days. And so I did that. Not to mention it was...
Was it the same recruiter that recruited you?
Yep. Went and talked to high schools and did all sorts of fairly interesting things. Wore BDUs in the middle of Queens, New York. It was kind of funny, actually. I remember one day I'm going in, and here I am, my hat's all nice and perfect, the uniform's nicely pressed, the boots are all shined and stuff. And I run into this guy who's wearing BDUs, and he has like dreads, and he has this like Tosh hat, and his boots are, the bottom of his stuff is like all out. It was a civilian just wearing, figuring that this stuff was cool, wearing it. And then he runs into me, and I'm looking at him like, who's this idiot? And he just kind of looked at me like, okay, with beard and mustache, of course. And then I'm like clean shaven, because I had a mustache up until the time I went to the military. And pretty much since then, since I shaved it off, I think I grew it back once and didn't like it, so I've stayed clean shaven ever since.
Now, your 10 days leave where you helped the recruiter, could you live at home and everything?
Yeah, I was home.
As you pleased otherwise?
Well, I was home, but pretty much you had set hours that you had to be at the recruiting office, and we were fairly flexible. We did a lot of cool stuff, and so I'd go to these schools and stuff and talk to people. And I remember getting into somewhat of an argument because this one girl, I was speaking at an auditorium, and this one girl walks up to me and says, "So why should I listen to you if women can't serve in combat roles?" And I was like, "Well, keep fighting for it. One day you might get it." Right? She said, "Nah, I want nothing to do with you." And I was like, "Okay." There's not much you can argue about that. It's policy above my head.
What did you do when you went back to McGuire? Was that for more training?
No, McGuire was my what they call the permanent duty station. At that point, I was done training and became a worker bee. So I was assigned to the hospital, which was actually on Fort Dix, and the med group, which was the 305th Medical Group. The dorm was actually an Army dorm, an Army barracks with an Army chow hall in the barracks itself, which was kind of cool. And everybody else would come to our barracks for chow, because at that time, Fort Dix, when I first got there, Fort Dix was drawing down as an active duty military base. And there were a couple active duty guys who were around. We had one that worked in the hospital.
Wait, now Fort Dix is Army.
Fort Dix is Army, but it's right next to McGuire. McGuire at the time did not have a medical facility, so the Air Force ran Walton Air Force Hospital, which was previously Walton Army Hospital. But at that time, pretty much they had drawn down the services because it was a really old building and kind of scary, and some of the floors up there were kind of scary. I believe it's been torn down, but I haven't been around there to find out. Our housing was actually on Fort Dix, which was kind of cool. At the time, you could actually drive through Fort Dix. This is before 9/11, and actually a lot before they really locked down stuff.
So what year was this then that you would have been?
1995. It would have been about June or July of 95. But yeah, you could at the time you could drive through Fort Dix. You could actually drive up to the facility, which you can't do now. And then we started restricting because the pharmacy was on the ground floor, right next to the main entrance to the hospital, and there was a driveway that went right up. And we used to allow pharmacy patients to park. There were handicap slots there, and they could park and go. Come in and get their refills or whatever and leave. Now, and I think somewhere around near the end of when I was there, they blocked it off and prevented people from doing it. I think there were some bombings or something in the kind of scared the people with.
So you were a pharmacy tech at the pharmacy at Fort Dix?
Yes.
That's where you would report to work every day?
Correct.
And your barracks were actually right there in Fort Dix too?
Yes.
So you were an Air Force guy in Army territory?
Well, I was Air Force guy in what became an Army Reserve base. Even the cops switched over from active duty military folks to reserve folks, and then to what we call the rent-a-cops, which were essentially civilian police. It was kind of interesting. Yeah.
Were there a lot of other Air Force guys with you, or were you the only one?
No, the Air Force ran the hospital.
Oh, so
Right.
those were all Air Force personnel.
In the hospital, when I got there, we had one Navy guy and we had one Army tech. And I think both of them didn't re-enlist, and they just, they just went through. But yeah, that was the work environment.
So, and this was your duty station for your entire enlistment?
Correct.
What would a typical day be like for you? What kind of things did you do as a pharmacy tech?
Because we didn't have inpatient services. We had same-day surgeries, but nobody ever stayed overnight. We had a 24-hour emergency response, but other than that, nobody actually stayed there. Most of the time, you basically prepped them and transported them to like Mount Holly, which was the closest civilian hospital for emergencies or stuff. In some cases, we had sort of an ER that ran until I think like 10 o'clock at night, where we would come in and people would be stabilized or be seen, and then they would either leave or be transported. For me, we had relatively normal duty day, starting either at 7:30 or at 8, and basically cover pharmacy shift. And we had new prescriptions and refill windows, where we would do prescriptions. The refill side of things basically were two people that ran the entire place, and you would fill anywhere between 1,500 to 3,000 scripts a day. Just two people, just cranking out. It was fairly automated. The system that we had was fairly new. It was a system called Baker. It was run by the Baker Company, and the more popular drugs were located in these canisters that once they went through the computer, and they were electronically called in by people with a telephone. You just dial in your prescription number and they would set it up, and then a printer would print out the labels, and the Baker cells would go to work, and you'd have medicines in a little chute. Basically, you'd find the label, get the bottle, fill the bottle with the appropriate medication, and then you'd place it on top of the label, and then somebody would come through and check to make sure that the label matched the amount and the drug strength and stuff, and at that point they would put the label on. And you had these little stamps. Actually, I had my stamp. I was number 10. And the stamp would go, the person on the left side, that stamp on the left top side of the label is the one that filled it, the one that's stamped on the top right is the one that checked it. And so pretty much somebody else's eyes were almost always on it. And in most cases it would be a pharmacist checking, but not always. The neat thing about being in the military is that you can actually run a military pharmacy without a pharmacist.
Wow, when you're filling that many prescriptions in one day, did you ever make any mistakes?
Yeah, we made mistakes. Obviously, you have checks and balances in there to try and minimize that from happening, but it does happen occasionally. So even in civilian world, it did. But what was funny was that when I got out and when we first moved to Connecticut, I got a job with CVS, and I remember in my interview after. I tell them, because the guy asked me, he says, yeah, so what are your certifications? I said, well, I'm a nationally certified pharmacy technician. And he says, well, what sort of volume did you do? And I told him, I said, well, we'd fill between 1,500 and 3,000 scripts a day. And he was mind blown. He says, my entire pharmacy does probably like 2,500, and we're one of the biggest ones. I'm like, oh, yeah, I can handle that. And he thought I was cocky. And I was like, no, I'm being serious. This was normal for me. You get in there, and basically you didn't have a choice. People would be waiting for their stuff, so you just knock it out.
So you work pretty much a regular work day.
Yeah.
And then go home.
I won't go that far, but yeah.
Were you free before work and after work to come and go as you please, to do what you want?
Pretty much. Obviously, you're still in the military, so if you were assigned to special duty or something like that, then no. But which I ended up being. But yeah, you were pretty much free to come and go as you please as long as you showed up to work. And if you didn't show up to work, you either had a really good excuse, or it's one of the few jobs where you could go to jail for not showing up. But the dorms were about a 10-minute walk away across.
You lived right there on base.
We lived on base. There was a path between the dorm and the hospital, and pretty much we knew by to the second of how much time it took to get from the dorm in bed asleep to being at your duty station by 7:30 when the windows went up. It was kind of funny. My roommate and I would sleep in our shirts, basically be in shirts, underwear, and socks, and you'd be asleep with your boots and your BDU pants sitting right next to the bed, and the alarm clock would go off at 7:10. You'd basically swing around, put your feet right into the pants and boots, pull everything up, right? Tidy up, cinch up, grab the shirt, go do brush your teeth. And what was funny was that probably if you were standing outside at like 7:10, you would all of a sudden see everybody like flying out of their dorm rooms and getting into their cars and hey, can I ride with you? Yeah, you can ride with me. Yeah. Or the mass exodus of people down the path, and the people at the end usually running because you figured that they were late, because everybody was in place by 7:25, and 7:30 the windows went up, and that was it.
So how long were you at Walton Hospital?
Pretty much my entire for the 3 years and 10 months or whatever it was that I was there. I met my now ex-wife Barbara in tech school. She was in my what they call the basically the grandfather. We were their grandfather class, and I remember walking into
tech school at Shepherd.
At Shepherd. I remember walking into into her room because we went to school half day. So at noon we were done. You would come back, you'd get something to eat, and then between 1 and 3 you had an afternoon study session, and the ropes were responsible for going basically through the rooms and making sure that, 1, that they were there, 2, studying, and not goofing around. And she had just gotten there. I remember walking in, and her roommate, turned and smiled and said something and stuff, and she slowly turned around and looked at me, and she said something. And I remember looking at her, and the first words I ever said to her were, "Yeah, you're from New England, aren't you?" And she was like, "Yeah, I'm from Rhode Island." And we became friends after that.
And you married her?
Not then, no.
Oh. So,
no.
When did you get married?
We got married in June of '96. So it was sometime after that.
So you had already transferred to Walton.
I was already at McGuire, and she actually was also pharmacy tech. She was stationed in Mississippi at Keesler Air Force Base, which is in Biloxi, which is the same Air Force Base that the Hurricane Hunters used to fly out of, the C-130s that would fly into hurricanes. And she was a pharmacy tech there, and theirs was actually a full hospital, which was kind of cool. And when I was playing soccer and I blew my left ACL, I had 2 surgeries scheduled, and in between the surgeries they give you 30 days of leave. and pretty much I'm not going to sit in my dorm room and do nothing. So I hopped on Space Available or Space A flights. I would drive down to Andrews Air Force Base and get a military Space A flight, which was fairly constant, down to Keesler. And then from Keesler, I would fly back, Space A again, to strangely enough, it would go straight to McGuire, right? So I'd fly back, and then the next day I would take a Space A from McGuire to Andrews, pick up my car, and drive it home. But yeah.
So when you tore your ACL, where did they do the surgery? At your hospital?
Yeah. Well, the first one was yeah. There were two surgeries. The first one, for some reason, they never did an MRI to find out that it was actually torn. They did exploratory surgery, and so the first one was done at Walson. I went home. I went back to the dorm the same day, and I actually stayed with friends on McGuire. And the second one was done at Mount Holly Memorial Hospital in New Jersey, in Burlington, New Jersey. And that one I actually stayed overnight for.
What can you tell me about Walton Hospital?
Oof. It's probably about 8 stories tall. I actually have a picture over there of Barbara and myself in front of it. It was like an orange brick building. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, it pretty much was a fairly large happening hospital, Army, staffed by Army. And by the time that I had gotten there, there was a lot of issues with it. And the Air Force had, or Army, I can't remember which, had revamped the bottom 3 floors for use. And they were using, I think, like the 6th or the 7th floor for to store stuff. And occasionally, I got to go up into those higher floors, and the beds were still there, and in some cases they were still made, and you'd see like the standard hospital stuff, but everything's covered in dust. It was pretty bad. It was pretty interesting, and the only good thing about it is that once a year we would go up to the top floor to watch fireworks for July 4th, because the Army would put on fireworks, and it was probably the best place to watch fireworks, and obviously not everybody could get in. So it was pretty exclusive. You'd have a couple people that worked at the hospital that were there. That was pretty cool.
And you think that that's been torn down now?
Yeah, it's no longer. The Air Force built a new facility, which actually our pharmacy chief had a hand in designing, and that's where they're running out of. I think I left in '98. I think somewhere around 2000 or 2001 is when it was commissioned, and that's actually on McGuire Air Force Base proper.
So what was your rank?
I left. I was enlisted. I left as a senior airman or an E4. I had the option to re-enlist or to join the reserves or National Guard. I think at that point, I'd had a string of bad commanders, and Barbara had had shattered her right elbow, broken her left hand in an accident, and I was driving down to Bethesda twice to 3 times a week for physical therapy and for appointments and stuff, and we did that for a year and something, and we just didn't get any help. And at that point I felt that we were better off out instead of being in, and so I left.
I'm going to ask you some questions now just about daily life. How did you stay in touch with your family? Now, you never actually left the United States Post?
Correct.
So, how did you stay in touch with your family?
It was pretty easy, because being that I was in New Jersey and my mother at the time was living in Queens, right, it was just a drive home, so it wasn't that big of a deal. I remember in tech school, I had a lot of people that wanted to trade with me, because this was considered to be, from a geographic standpoint, to be a great assignment. So anybody that lived on the East Coast, wanted it badly. But one of the guys who was like really, really, really wanting to trade with me was going to Minot Air Force Base. And when I found out that the nickname for Minot was Why Not Minot, because it was considered to be it was considered to be a cold duty station stateside, and you know they issue you your mucklucks and your over jacket, and they're like, North Dakota, boy, really tough one. One of the guys actually had Guam, and I seriously thought about it for a while.
You were allowed to trade with people?
As long as you met the same qualifications, yeah. And I could go anywhere CONUS. So obviously the guys that were going to Germany and stuff didn't want to trade, but this one for Guam, he badly wanted to trade.
So when you were stationed at McGuire, could you go home on weekends and stay home if you wanted to?
Yeah, as long as you weren't on call, you can go. I mean, essentially, it became as much of a real job as as it was. I mean, I coached.
Typical Wisconsin 9-to-5 guy.
Yeah, I mean, I coached a soccer team and had. I played on the base soccer team for a while. I did things outside. It was the only restrictions became when you got onto deployment status or something like that, where then you obviously were. But even then, I think you were restricted to, I think it was like a 2 or 3 hour radius where you had to be able to get back to base within a certain time period. And I remember on weekends, I think they extended it to 5 or 6. So when Barbara got out prematurely, she was what we call boarded out. She got out on a medical board discharge. Parents who were in Rhode Island, so we would drive up on like a Friday evening, and then drive back. I would drive back Monday morning to go to work. Right, and that was permissible.
What was the food like? You must have had like, did you have like a dining room right in your barracks? When we were single, the dining room was there. The Air Force dining facility. Okay, here comes my first commander story. The Air Force dining facilities were considered, and still are considered, to be the best in the military. You get really, really good food, and they're like simple little things. There were televisions in the dining halls, so you could actually like watch. You can go and get as much food as you wanted for all 4 meals of the day if you wanted. So 4 meals?
Yep, you had breakfast, lunch, dinner, and what they call midnight rations or midrats, because obviously the base runs 24 hours a day, and for some people that's lunch, right? And usually midrats would be a combination of, you can get eggs or stuff like breakfast food, or they would have leftovers from dinner. So and the food was actually good. When we would get steak every now and then. We would get, my last day in the I remember going across to the army chow hall, and the choices, I kid you not, were either steak or lobster tail. I wish I was kidding. And at the time, because I was married and I was collecting what they call BAS, or basic allowance for subsistence, I paid $2.40 for a lobster tail. $2.40. That was the daily rate. Sorry, that was the rate per meal. You walked in, you paid it.
So when you go to the mess hall, you paid.
Well, at the time you paid, because I was on BAS. If I was single living in the dorms, I wouldn't pay. I just show them my ID and go in. But because I lived on base housing, you didn't live in a barracks, in a dorm. They would give you the thing.
What's your commander story?
When I first got to McGuire, because the chow hall on McGuire was closed for renovations, they were giving everyone on the base BAS, and pretty much for us, we would get the BAS, which was basically like a bonus in our salary, but we were still eating at the chow hall on Fort Dix. right? And we weren't paying, we were just showing your ID. Everybody was doing it. I was told that that's normal. So we said fine. Then the chow hall reopened, and the chow hall had one on McGuire, right? And McGuire, for a sense of reference, was probably about a 15-minute drive from the barracks, from where we were, because basically you have to like drive around Fort Dix, go through the base, get into the central area and stuff. So it's like a good 10 to 15-minute drive. So it wasn't something that you could do every day, right? We would eat there occasionally, but it wasn't something that you wanted to try to do every day. And one day, probably about 8 to 9 months after I'd gotten back, after they'd given us back, they'd brought the thing online, the chow hall online. I get a call that the commander wanted to see me, and so I go down there, and I'm dressed in regular clothes. And I walk into her office, and like, ma'am, did you want to see me? And she's like, well, not like this. You will get dressed in uniform, and you will come back here and report to me. And I'm thinking, okay. So go get dressed, come back, and I step through the door, and she starts reading me my rights. And I'm like, what did I do? And she's like, you've been collecting BAS. And you never notified us that you were collecting BAS. I'm like, yes, I did. Like, we all did. Like, a whole bunch of us. We're still getting this, and we keep reporting it. And a whole bunch of us actually got letters of reprimand because we didn't notify them sooner. And my very next paycheck was exactly $12, where I had bills and stuff. And basically, they cut it out. They cut us all off, which we found unfair because there were a lot of people that got the debt forgiven by order of the Secretary of the Air Force at the time, who was Sheila Widnall, and doing all. I mean, there were people that kept getting it, and we kept saying, "Look, this is the situation." A lot of us got it. A lot of us from under her. Right? I mean, some of the other commanders were like, yeah, okay, it's our screw up. It's the Air Force's screw up. Don't worry about it. We'll waive it, or we'll take it out piece by piece or whatever. And I remember going across to, I remember telling my supervisor, because I'm like, yeah, $12 is, I got stuff to do. And I remember going across to the finance folks and talking to the NCOIC, and I remember the airman there asking the NCOIC, says, can they do this? And the guy's like, oh yeah, they can do it. It's not very fair. All right, and I said, look, if you give me half now and half the next paycheck, I can take that. I said, but and even after I'd gotten mine straightened out, there were still guys collecting it for months afterward. And she basically screwed him to a post. There was a lot of letters of reprimand. There were a lot of one guy she even threatened to court-martial because of it. His supervisor, who was a good friend of mine, stood up for him and said, "No," he says, "we came to you and said that." And she really turned a lot of people off of the military.
Did you always have enough supplies, enough of the drugs you needed for the prescriptions?
We were a little. We were in a unique situation because we would actually get probably the largest budget in the hospital, right? And that's essentially what it was spent on. And we being the pharmacy, in most cases the pharmacy chief and the superintendent, would dictate as to how the money was spent in purchasing drugs. We had a set formulary that were mostly generics. We had a high dollar drug program for stuff like interferon and other drugs that were not common but that you needed, right? Because at the time, this is before TRICARE was fully implemented. Anyone with a military ID card
could go to the pharmacy and get drugs for free. It didn't cost you anything. And this is everything from birth control to whatever, but it had to be on our formulary. I remember when Viagra first came out, it had been out a couple months, and a guy a retiree walked up to me and he says, "Yeah, I want you to get me some of that there Viagra." And I tell him, I said, "Sir, I'm sorry, we can't because it's not on our formulary." And he got mad at me and actually screamed at me. He says, if it was some sort of general, I'm sure you'd do it." I'm like, "No, we wouldn't, sir, because it's not on our formulary." So, yeah, it provided for interesting times sometimes. But.
Did you ever feel pressure or stress on your job?
It's still the military. One of the interesting parts of what I did in 1997, Barbara and I went on vacation to Trinidad for Carnival. And I was gone for 3 weeks, and when I came back, I found out that I was selected, quote unquote, to be on what they call a mobility augmentee, which meant that I went over to the passenger terminal at McGuire because we were a air mobility command base. We had cargo planes, and we moved cargo and people all throughout the world. And that's where I actually learned how to drive a bus and to work a forklift and do all these really interesting things, because essentially I augmented them during what they call an ORI, or an operational readiness inspection. And the ORI started off by moving the entire mobility section. So basically you had all these people that were that could be mobilized to set up and go somewhere else and basically play war. In this particular case, it was they set up camp in New Mexico, and they had basically shipped all your mobility people from McGuire to New Mexico.
So did you go to New Mexico?
No, I stayed and played with the buses and played war games and stuff at the base. They didn't want to make us feel left out.
Why did you have to learn how to drive a bus and a forklift?
Well, essentially I had to learn how to do everything that the guys at the passenger terminals had to do, even though it wasn't my primary AFSC. So
it had nothing to do with your medical skills.
Zero. I was a warm body that was selected. That was it. And so, which actually turned out to be great in some ways and not so great in some ways, because I get there and I qualified on almost everything. I learned how to drive a stair truck, which is these trucks that would go up to the airplane, and you basically had this like this huge stairs on your back, and you'd learn how to like position it to the side of an airplane. And I learned how to drive a deuce and a half, which is a 2.5 ton truck. Deuce 2.5 ton truck. And I mean, I had a lot of fun learning until then I realized that this was going to be an ongoing process for I think I did it for about 14 months. And what would happen is that I would work my job for however long, and then they say, okay, tomorrow you're being, because they were having these exercises every 2 weeks. So I would work 2 weeks for my job, go sleep, show up the next morning and work 14 hours at the passenger terminal. And basically you'd work the 14 hours, you would go home, sleep, get something to eat, and then go back, right? Because essentially you didn't have time for anything else, and you just did this for as long as they said that the exercise was going on.
So typically, how long would you be doing that during an exercise?
For 14 hours, 13 to 14 hours.
How many days?
2 weeks.
2 weeks straight?
2 weeks straight. There were no weekends. And you would do this basically, as I said, go home, sleep, come back, go home, sleep, come back. And so I worked at the passenger terminal. I'd do both the regular stuff as well as the war game stuff. I mean, there was one time that they told us, all right, there's a bomb threat being called in. You have to move all of your
all of your operations into a bus. And so basically we packed, and this is like 1 a.m, it's freezing out. So we packed everybody and everything into a bus that we could get our hands on, right? Moved in. And the guys who were there for normal passengers and stuff, because we were still running Space A flights and all this stuff, you know, they were like, ha ha, good for you, and laughing at us while they were in there just, you know, doing their everyday normal stuff.
Do you have any memorable experiences from that time?
A lot of really good friends I made there. What was good about it was that I got to play with all these neat toys. I got to climb all over aircraft. First time I ever touched a C5. I'd go up and, you know, interact with the pilots and get loading documents and actually learn what like real Air Force was. Right? I mean, as a medic, you get some of it, right? But a very small smattering. This is actually operational Air Force, and it was a lot of fun. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about aircraft and all sorts of other things. But then the people at the passenger terminal found out that I was enthusiastic and I was a quick learner. And after that first time, I got put on midnights. I got put on graveyard shifts. So for the rest of that 14 months, I was running the 2 weeks. I was on night shifts, and that was brutal because it would screw up your sleep schedule. And
you could do the same thing, but at the midnight shift.
Yeah, but it's hard. It's, I mean, their job's not easy. Their job was not as mentally tasking as mine was, right? Because I mean, you're basically trying not to make mistakes doing pharmacy stuff, and you know, the occasional IV and stuff like that. I mean, you screw up, somebody could die. All right, with these guys, you make a mistake, it means that somebody's bag ended up at Thule in Greenland rather than in New Mexico, which could suck, but it's not fatal, you know, for most people. Speaking of which, there was one of the NCOs at the passenger terminal. I was born in Trinidad and grew up in the States, and so we kind of clicked. And one day, one of the SPs, or the security policeman, gave him a ticket and was really, really nasty to him. And the guy was being deployed to New Mexico. And this guy just like shook his head and said, okay, we'll see what happens. And he took his bag and walked over to a bin that was going to Thule in Greenland and threw his bag in the bin. So this guy gets to New Mexico and didn't have a change of underwear or a change of clothes or anything for quite some time, because obviously the bag had to go to Thule, spend a couple days. They realized, hey, wait a minute, nobody's claiming this, ship it back, right? And at that point, like, okay, yeah, we'll throw it on the next flight. So he was without a bag for probably 5 to 6 days easily, you know. So that's kind of when you learn you don't piss off the medics, you don't piss off, you know, you can even piss the cops off, but there are other people that the standard thing in Air Force was that the medics controlled your shot records. And I remember one guy coming in one day and he was swearing up and down because his wife had gotten a ticket from this guy. It turned out actually to be the same guy. And he went into this guy's medical records, pulled out his shot records and shredded them. And this guy was a deployment candidate. So when they found that he didn't have any shot records, he had to get all the shots over, every last one of them.
Now,
I don't remember his name, so I can't be, I can't be held accountable.
you want to tell me the story behind the broken glass?
When I was single, there was within the dorm, obviously there's a leader for the dorm. He was a senior airman by the name of Lewis. His last name escapes me. But Lewis drove a Ford Probe, and one day they had a birthday party for one of the guys at a bar off base.
This is Shepherd?
No, this is at McGuire. Oh, Fort Dix. All right. And Lewis was in charge of the, basically he was in charge of us, and we were all good friends. And actually, I got invited to the birthday party, but for some reason, I can't remember now why I couldn't go. And the party, and I'll just leave these on top here because they become relevant later on. The party, you know, I decided not to go. I went to bed, and the next morning I think I had to go out to referee a soccer game. And I remember leaving probably about 6:30 in the morning to go to the game, and there was an area about a block away from the dorm on one of the access roads that was roped off in police tape, where I couldn't see any cars. There was a tree there. It was right by Fort Dix information, the information office, which was closed obviously because it was a weekend. And I couldn't really see much, so I just kept going. Come to find out, Lewis drove his car with his girlfriend, who was a civilian, and her best friend, who was also a civilian. The best friend was in the back seat, sitting in the middle. Lewis was driving, probably doing the average somewhere between 80 and 90 miles an hour, and had been drinking. The girlfriend had been drinking, and nobody was wearing a seatbelt. He hits a bump. It's not a very big bump because I've driven over the bump several times after that. He hits this bump and apparently started veering off and hit the tree square, doing, as I said, between 80 and 90 miles an hour. His girlfriend was ejected from the car. She landed onto asphalt. He was ejected, landed on the grass in front of the base information office. The girl in the back seat, basically the car split in two. The girl in the back seat was cut off at the waist and died at the spot. And this was somebody I'd met casually. I didn't really know her. I knew his girlfriend a little better, but Lewis I knew, and I knew that he'd had a pretty rough life and that he pretty much patched himself together and was, you know, trying to get there. His best friend was following probably about 2 minutes behind, gets to the accident scene, realizes what's going on, tried to do CPR on Lewis's girlfriend, and realized that he's going to be doing CPR forever, so he needs to go get help. Like, our training went to the dorm, pulled some guys out, just banged on a couple doors. We went out, and by that time, basically the hospital had responded because he called the hospital, and here's Lewis, who's one of the medics, right, unconscious on the ground, bleeding. The girlfriend's bleeding from her nose and her mouth and everything else. The other one's dead. It was like blatantly obvious, and they had to scoop him up and take him. Both girls died that night. Well, one died instantly. The other one, I think, was dead within the hour.
When he came banging on the door, that's when you...
I was on the second floor. I didn't hear a thing. I slept right through it. If I was there, I would definitely have gone to help. But yeah, they were. The two girls were dead. Lewis had broken his legs. He had really bad brain damage and stuff. He was in a coma for most of the time with minimal response. Eventually, he was moved from the hospital to a VA rehab facility, and about 3 months after that, he also died, which probably was the best thing, because had he stayed alive, he'd still be in jail for 2 cases of manslaughter, vehicular manslaughter. I mean, I went to the funerals with the girls. I spoke to one girl's dad. I mean, what do you tell these people, right? But after we found out what was going on and stuff, I went to the accident site and I picked up 2 pieces of glass that were from the windscreen, which is what these are. And it's kind of like a reminder to me that, you know what, this is This is drinking and driving close to home. Right? Literally close to home. This was a block and a half away from the dorm. Right? What was interesting about the story was that a whole bunch of guys that went to, there's probably about 9 guys that went to the party, got together and decided that they were going to collude and say that there was no underage drinking and that they weren't at the same party that he was. And the investigators were kind of going through this and they were like, no, something's fishy here. And they spoke to one of Lewis's girlfriend's best friends, whose name is Portia, and she fingered them all. She said, no, he was at the party, he was at the party, he was at the party. There was underage drinking there was this, there was that. And a lot of guys, they court-martialed a whole bunch of them, and a lot of them got Article 15s and lost a stripe. One guy lost 2 stripes. It was bad. It was really, really bad. It was a very, very sad thing. And in some ways, I'm glad that I didn't go to the party. Right? But I mean, I'm not much of a drinker then or now. I've been drunk once in my entire life. And I think this more or less was kind of resolution that, you know what, really isn't worth it. And that hit hard. That hit hard home because, I mean, he was a really good guy. He had his issues, but you know, he had a really rough life, and the family didn't deserve that. So yeah, that's my story of the little glass that I keep. I take it out every blue moon and look at it.
Do you have any other memorable experiences that you recall from your service?
We had a call once. We have many, but I kind of have to pick and choose because we only have 2 hours. We had a call once where, because we're an active reserve, we're a reserve base, so reservists had taken a deuce and half. And a lot of the roads on Fort Dix is a very, very large base. There are tank ranges, there's all sorts of stuff. And a lot of the roads that go in there, it can easily take you, 20 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes to get to some parts of the base. And the Army reservist, I remember, was driving a deuce and half, doing probably about 60, 65. And the vehicle's not made to do this. And he flipped it, going around the corner, and it took the ambulance close to half an hour to get there, by which time he had severed 2 of his fingers into the roadway. I'd done the ride-along, I can't remember why, but I was actually there at the ride-along on the ambulance, and he'd severed 2 of his fingers because he was holding on to the top of the thing, wheel with one hand, he's holding on with the other hand. Well, it's probably been this way since, but ended up cutting 2 of his fingers off, and both passengers died. Both passengers were ejected, and he was charged with vehicular manslaughter. In that case, brought back. He was reservist, brought onto active duty, and spent time in Quantico. So. The military is a great place to be from. It's not necessarily a great place to be. It's been a very good asset to me in my life. It's a lot of the things that I learned then I still have as part of my being and my personality, and it's taught me a lot of leadership skills and definitely things, but a lot of the lessons that you learn from the military are really harsh. A lot of the people that you serve with, you know that they can get orders tomorrow morning and you'd never see them again. Thank goodness for Facebook. A lot of us are like talking and communicating and stuff because you spend a lot of time with these people, a lot of developmental periods of your life with these people. You form bonds, you form friendships, and it's not very easily mentally to switch off. And
what did you think of your fellow soldiers?
Airmen?
Sorry, Kevin. I know better.
I think the biggest thing that you realize, especially when I went through basic training and I had to deal with Airman Allen, the guy with the pictures of the guns, is that not everybody in the military is this great hero that that civilians want them to be portrayed as. You know, there are, in some cases, they're very much everyday people. And don't get me wrong, because I believe that we owe a lot of them a lot of our gratitude and thanks. And like the World War II guys who just came home and just wished that it never happened. There are a lot of them that join because they want to be Rambo, or they want the glory and don't realize what exactly it is to be in the military. And I remember, especially as active duty, where you would work hard to try and get, you know, you have your qualifications, you have your whatever, and you're working hard to get these things to keep them up, to do, you know, to do this. So this is your job. This is what you do for a living. And then you'd have a reservist that would come in and be like, "Yeah, I want to do all these great qualifications. And can I get it done in a weekend?" And you're like, "No." And then somebody would pencil whip them through, and you'd be mad. And a lot of times we active duty folk would get really get a negative connotation to reservists because of this. Just before we came in here, we saw a National Guard full bird colonel who walked through the parking lot without a hat. Some people may say that it's nitpicky, but I mean it's a respect for the uniform thing, and I got mad at him. Right? Even now, I mean, I've been out of the service for almost 12 years, and it's like, you know what? It's stuff like that still resonates with me. You know, it may be my ADD nature or something, but no, it's.
What did you think of the officers?
You had good ones, you had bad ones. Air Force is a little different, and I think Air Force Medical was probably the most lax in terms of relationships with officers. I made some very good friends with officers that nowadays I think with fraternization maybe would be kind of frowned upon, but I mean they were people too. A lot of them I'm still in very good contact with, and you know, and we still have good friendships. I don't think, and there were some of them, like my commander, that eventually we figured out that basically she hated men, because the only people that got in trouble with her for long term were men. We had some really bad commanders that probably without which I might still be in the military. Right? But when you get to the point where you don't trust the people that are leading you, it becomes an issue. I started actually the project for the first website for McGuire Air Force Base. Right, this was back in the day when the internet was a little young. I was a computer guy. I was a computer geek that just happened to be doing medic stuff. But I still wanted to do computers, and I'd go out and help them as much as I can. I remember laying cable occasionally for for Waltz and infrastructure stuff. And then I decided that I wanted to help write the first web page, so I did. You know, met with the commander, and you know, came up with ideas and stuff. And a master sergeant got wind of what I was doing and said that he would help in the project. And I was like, sure, you know, you have stripes, you can probably help get through. And I went and visited all of the commanders for the different parts of the hospital, and they were all enthusiastic except for mine. You know, she was, why do you want to do this? Well, ma'am, because I think that we'd be good having a public. What is this going to impact my time? How is it? And she started like giving me the nth degree. All the other commanders like, great, what do you need? How can we help?
this is a great push, it'll be great for the hospital. And I remember, like, immediately after about 30 seconds with my own commander being on the defensive, because she was like, what, it's a good idea. So we put together the web page, and I submitted all my stuff to this master sergeant. We publish it, and he takes my name off and took full credit for it. And both he and my commander ended up getting a medal for it, and I didn't.
So you said you were a computer geek back then, which leads to your career. When you got out of the service, what did you want to do?
I got out of the service and pretty much had been keeping abreast with computer stuff. I was a computer geek before I went in, computer geek after. While I was in, I coached soccer. I started actually the first Fort Dix youth soccer teams. We had two teams. I think they were U10 and U12 at the time, and we basically, Barbara and I started the two teams. Initially, we had done an indoor league at Fort Dix because they actually had the boards and everything. We got them to put the boards up, and we ran an indoor league there and made money for the base.
Was this for kids or adults?
Kids. I think the oldest was U16, U18. So we did that, and then we figured out that there was a need. So we went ahead and formed the two girls team, and we coached the teams. And after I think one season, after a year, it was a complete year. I had moved to Bordentown, and pretty much we took some of the players from there, moved to Bordentown, New Jersey, and coached out of Bordentown. And then from there, came here and started coaching here when we were here. But
I know you still do that now. Did you go back to school after your military service?
I was actually going to school during the time. I did the GI Bill, which at the time you paid $100 from your first 12 paychecks, which was rough because you weren't getting paid very much. All right, so you paid that, and then if you went to school in the Air Force, at the time, the Air Force was probably the best of all the services to do this. They would actually, as long as you got a C or better, C minus or better, they would pay for tuition. So you would pay anything. You'd sign the slip, they would forward it to the base would pay it. So I got quite a few classes done that way. Worked towards my community college or the Air Force degree, which at the time I believe was the first time that you could actually get military training and get college credits for it and work towards a degree. Now I think all four services have something of the equivalent. And the Air Force would actually go a step further, where you would have classes on base. There was actually an entire education thing, and they were paying for degrees, and it was education was majorly pushed. After a while, I think they had to end the program of paying for it wholesale, and it was only after I got out that I ended up using the GI Bill and going to school.
Do you recall your last day in service?
Yeah.
What was your last day like?
I wore dress blues. I remember that. I remember I went to work. Email was still in its infancy, and the system that we were running on was based on a Unix system. It was kind of a proprietary thing. So it was all green screens. We had one machine that ran Windows in the thing, and I played a prank on my supervisor once with it. But anyway, yeah, I remember going in dress blues and stuff, and I remember writing an email to everyone in the pharmacy, just saying, this has been great 4 years. It's been wonderful. Thank you for working with me. I've not been perfect or the best or the greatest, but
You know, I'll definitely remember and cherish you all, and thank you. And pretty much hit send and walked out. And the next day, the code on the pharmacy door was changed as per protocol. That's normal because I didn't work there anymore. And I think I had 30-something days of leave. So I was working at. I got a job. One of the soccer parents. This is where soccer came in. One of the parents on the soccer team, who we were very, very close with, like really, really close, ended up getting me a job at what was then NTEX Information Systems. It was a computer geek job. Not making a lot of money, but enough so that we could survive and then some. But the office was in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. So by that time we had moved off base. I think we were off base for like the last 9 months. And I was driving an hour and 15 minutes each way to King of Prussia from Bordentown, New Jersey. A lot of times working the night shift, so I was leaving home at 10 a.m. I was leaving home at 9 to get to work for 10:30, and coming home at 7. Leaving work at 7 p.m. But without that, I think that was pretty much the foundation for where I am now. Because without that real practical experience and them willing to take a chance on me, I don't think I would have gotten a system admin job anywhere even close.
And what are you doing now?
Now I work for Central Connecticut State University as a system administrator. Previous to this, I worked for the system office for 9 years. One of the things that I'd done at NTEX, which became part of Siemens, and actually now is part of Siemens, which is a Fortune 500 company, is that I did Lotus Notes support. And before I got to NTEX, I never even knew it. I didn't know how to spell Lotus Notes. But I learned, I got certified, then I came here and answered an ad in the paper one day. And it was in the Current. And I answered the ad. Found out that it was there. They needed a Lotus Notes admin, so I submitted it, whatever, and got called for an interview about a month and a half later. Went to the interview and didn't hear anything for 2.5 months, at which time I'd already started another job. And Ernie Marquez, who was the human resources director at the system office at the time, calls me at home one day, and he's like, "Is this Kevin?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's Kevin." This is, and he introduces himself, and he's like, "I'd like to offer you the job." And I remember going, "It's been 2.5 months. You sure you have the right guy?" I literally told him this, and he's like, "Yeah." And we talked salary and stuff, and I was like, "And you're serious?" And he's like, "Yeah, we're very serious. We're very serious." And so I started. Which is kind of funny because years later I did a tribute to Ernie at his retirement. A lot of pictures and stuff of him and his parents who had died by that time, and his growing up in Cuba and stuff. And one of the final slides had ... "Are you serious?" question mark on there, and like inside joke. So, no.
Kevin, how did your military service affect your life?
Wow. I think like the world moves on time, before Christ and Anno Domini. I think that the change in my life was pretty much just as dramatic. I mean, I was self-assured and stuff before then, but I left the military, 1, married, 2, with a lot more experience, worldly experience, with a lot more friends that I still have to this day, changed attitude, completely different outlook, a lot more mature. I don't think that there really could be another way to say that that it definitely was a positive influence on my life. Good lumps, bad lumps, and different, and not all the things that happened in the Air Force were wonderful and great, but it's a decision that I think I would do again, especially at that time of my life.